The night security guard saw it first. He had been walking the dock at Solomon's Island Marina for 11 months when he noticed the boat that didn't belong. It was tied at the far end of Pier C, past the last of the waterman's workboats, and it was too clean. Too new. The kind of boat that had never hauled a crab pot in its life. Anchor found what was on it before Ray said a single word. The German shepherd stopped at the hull, pressed his nose to the fiberglass, circled once, and held position. That was not a random sniff. That was the behavior of a dog who had been trained in spaces far more dangerous than a Maryland marina dock. That was the behavior of a dog who had found something real. Ray crouched beside him and listened to the water. He had learned in the Navy that the quietest moments were sometimes the ones that required the most attention. What came off that boat, what Anchor pulled into the light of that dock, would reach further than the marina. It would reach into the past 60 years of a community's life, and into the plans of people who had decided that this particular corner of the Chesapeake Bay was worth more empty than full. Some things hide on quiet water for a very long time. A dog with the right training changes that. Ray Voss had served 21 years in the United States Navy as an explosive ordnance disposal technician. He had gone into the water in places the public would never read about, disarming things that should not have been where they were, in conditions that made most other dangerous work seem orderly by comparison. He was 58 years old. Lean and wiry in the way men become when they have spent years doing work that requires them to fit into small spaces. His hair was white and close-cropped. His face was weathered. His gray eyes had the particular quality of someone who had spent a career noticing things that were out of place. He had left the Navy 4 years ago and found that civilian life, the particular version of it available to a man who had spent 2 decades doing classified work in underwater environments, required some adjustment. He had ended up in Solomon's Island, Maryland, in the way that things sometimes happened, by following something that felt right rather than something that was planned. The marina job had been available. The cottage at the edge of town had been cheap. The town itself, a small waterman's community on a peninsula where the Patuxent River met the Chesapeake Bay, had the particular quality of a place that did not ask many questions about a man who did not offer many answers. Anchor had been his for 3 years. A retired military working dog, same as the ones Ray had deployed alongside for 2 decades. Different job, working dogs in EOD worked above ground while divers worked below, but the same fundamental training, systematic, patient, precise. Anchor had been retired due to age. Ray had adopted him through the organization that handled working dog placements because the dog reminded him of the way he himself had worked. Methodically. Without drama. Toward what was actually there. The marina was quiet work. Ray walked the docks from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. He checked lines, checked lights, logged anything unusual. Anchor moved with him through every shift, working the perimeter with the same focused patience he would have given any assignment. The waterman knew Ray by sight. Not well, he was not a man who invited that, but they nodded at him when they came in before dawn to prep their boats, and he nodded back. Over 11 months, he had learned which boats belonged to whom. Which lines were always too slack and needed adjusting. Which men came in at 3 in the morning because the crabs were running and which came in at 3 because they couldn't sleep. He knew Ezra Banks the way you know a landmark. The old man had worked Pier B for 60 years. His boat, the Patuxent Girl, was 32 feet of wooden hull that had been repaired in so many places it was difficult to say how much of the original remained. Ezra came in at 4 every morning, went out at 5, and came back with his catch by noon. He was 74 years old and had no intention of stopping. That was what Chad Merritt had not understood. The notice had been posted on the Marina Bulletin Board 3 weeks before Ray noticed the foreign boat on Pier C. It was a formal legal document. Ray had read enough Navy paperwork to understand the structure even when the language obscured the meaning. The marina had been purchased, quietly, through a series of transactions that had taken nearly 2 years, by a holding company registered in Delaware. That holding company had a pending agreement with a freight logistics firm. The waterfront was being rezoned. Traditional commercial fishing berths would be eliminated. The working docks would be converted. The waterman had 60 days. Ray had stood at the bulletin board for 4 minutes reading the document. Then he had walked the rest of his shift without saying anything. The town meeting had been called for the following Tuesday. Ray did not attend town meetings. He walked the dock on Tuesday nights the same as every other night. But the meeting was held in the community hall 40 yards from the waterfront, and the windows were open in the June heat, and sound carried over water. He heard Ezra's voice before he heard anyone else's. The old man was not shouting. He was making a specific point, clearly and without heat, that his family had held a commercial fishing license on this waterfront since 1961. That 3 generations of his family had worked off this pier. That the notice gave no provision for relocation assistance, no recognition of existing long-term berth agreements, and no timeline that allowed for orderly transition. He heard the response from the other side of the hall. Chad Merritt's voice had the pleasant authority of a man who knew the answer to every objection before it was raised because he had already arranged the outcome. He said he appreciated Ezra's history with the marina and that the company had every respect for the community's fishing tradition. He said the transition timeline was consistent with applicable law. He said he was sure accommodations could be found. The windows were open and the word accommodations floated across the water and reached Ray on the dock. Anchor stopped walking. He looked in the direction of the community hall. Ray looked at the dog. He said, "Yeah. I heard it too." 3 days later, 2 men Ray did not recognize arrived at the marina in a leased truck and began photographing the docks from the parking lot. Ray logged them in his report. He noted the make and model of the truck. He noted the time and the direction they walked. Anchor watched them from the dock, his amber eyes tracking the 2 men the same way they tracked anything that moved through the perimeter without an established reason to be there. The following Thursday night, the boat on Pier C appeared. The boat was a 30-foot center console. White fiberglass, recent manufacture. The registration numbers were Maryland. The name on the stern was Marginal Return. It had been tied at the end of Pier C without a berth agreement on file. Ray checked the logs. Nothing. Anchor was already at the hull. He worked it bow to stern twice, nose reading the fiberglass and the dock lines and the air above the deck. He stopped at the stern compartment, a storage locker built into the transom, and held his position with the particular certainty that meant this was not proximity and not curiosity. This was a find. Ray did not touch the boat. He photographed it with his phone. He documented the time, the location, the registration numbers, the position of the dock lines. He wrote it in his log. The next morning, he drove to the County Marina Authority office and asked about the Pier C registration. The clerk looked it up and told him the berth had been reserved by the holding company that now owned the marina. She said it was within their rights as owners to dock vessels on their own property. Ray said he understood. He drove back to Solomon's Island and found Ezra prepping the Patuxent girl at Pier B. He told Ezra what he had found. He did not speculate. He said a boat belonging to the new ownership had appeared on the pier without advance notice, that his dog had flagged the stern compartment, and that he thought Ezra should know. Ezra looked at the boat on Pier C for a long moment. He said, "That's a surveying vessel." Ray asked how he knew. Ezra said he had been watching boats on this water for 60 years. He pointed to the mounting brackets on the gunwale, the antenna configuration, the specific arrangement of equipment bags visible through the side window. He said, "They're not fishing. They're measuring." That evening, Ray called a former Navy colleague now working for a maritime law firm in Annapolis. He described what he had observed and what Ezra had identified. He asked what that combination of equipment might be used for. His colleague called back 2 hours later with an answer that was specific and not good. The surveying equipment indicated bathymetric mapping, detailed depth and bottom composition analysis of the bay floor. The kind used for engineering feasibility studies on underwater infrastructure. The kind required before a dredging application. If the holding company was planning to dredge the Solomon's Island waterfront and reconfigure the pier infrastructure, the scope of what they were building was not a renovation. It was a freight terminal. A foreign cargo company operating a freight terminal on this particular stretch of Chesapeake Bay would require federal maritime permits. Those permits would include public comment periods. Those comment periods would require the company to disclose their plans. But if those disclosures were timed after the waterman's 60-day notice expired, after Ezra and the other fishing berths were cleared, there would be no organized local opposition in place to respond. The sequence was deliberate. Ray sat with this information for a night and a day. Anchor stayed close, pressing his shoulder against Ray's leg on the cottage porch while Ray looked at the water. The following Monday, Chad Merritt arrived at the marina with 2 lawyers and held what was described on the posted notice as an informational session for affected berth holders. Ray was working his shift. He stood at the edge of the parking lot with Anchor and watched. Ezra arrived with 4 other watermen. They were older men, dressed in work clothes. They carried folders with documents. Merritt's lawyers did most of the talking. The language was civil and technical and designed to move the meeting toward a conclusion that had already been decided. When Ezra attempted to raise the question of whether the berth holders had been given adequate notification of the ownership change and its implications under Maryland Commercial Waterway Statute, one of the lawyers told him the notification had been legally sufficient. Ezra said he was not asking whether it had been legally sufficient. He was asking whether they had been told what the property was actually going to be used for. There was a pause. Merritt smiled and said the plans were still in development. Ray watched Merritt's face when he said it. He had spent 21 years in EOD learning to read the specific expression of a man who knows exactly where the problem is and is choosing not to say. That night, Anchor led him to the stern compartment of the marginal return again. This time Ray looked more carefully at the locker. There was a combination lock, not part of the original boat hardware. It had been added recently. The paint around the mounting screws was unweathered. Ray photographed it and noted it in his log. He called his colleague in Annapolis again. He said, "How do you file a public records request on a federal maritime permit application in the pre-disclosure phase?" The records request took 9 days. What came back was not the full application, that was still in pre-disclosure, but the public-facing correspondence log showed 2 entries that should not have been there. Communications between the holding company's registered agent and a federal permit coordinator dated 8 weeks before the 60-day notices were issued to the waterman. The company had begun the federal permit process before notifying the waterman. That was not fraud on its face. But it was the specific sequence that Ezra's maritime lawyer, the one Ray had quietly suggested he contact through his Annapolis colleague, needed to argue that the 60-day notice had been issued in bad faith, coordinated with a federal permitting timeline designed to expire before opposition could organize. The lawyer filed for an emergency injunction on a Wednesday morning. Merritt arrived at the marina on Wednesday afternoon. He was not smiling. He walked to where Ray was checking dock lines on Pier B. He said he understood that Ray had made some inquiries that had caused difficulties. He said he wanted to be clear that the marina's security contract was issued by the new ownership and that contract was subject to renewal. Ray listened to this without expression. Anchor, who had been sitting at Ray's left side, turned his head and looked at Merritt with amber eyes that carried no warmth and no hostility, simply the complete attention of an animal who has assessed a situation and formed a conclusion. Merritt looked at the dog and looked away quickly. Ray said, "The inquiries were part of my job." Merritt said that was a matter of interpretation. Ray said, "You're standing on a working commercial pier. You have a federal permit application in pre-disclosure that you filed 8 weeks before you notified the people whose livelihoods this affects. The documents your surveyors left on that boat include bathymetric studies commissioned for a freight infrastructure project that requires disclosure under NEPA. You did not disclose." He paused. "That is a matter of federal environmental law, not interpretation." Merritt was quiet for 3 seconds. He said, "Who are you?" Ray said, "Night security." The injunction was granted on Friday. The 60-day timeline was suspended pending review. The federal permit application was flagged for compliance audit. The bathymetric survey documents from the marginal return stern compartment, which Merritt's team had opened and removed the day after Ray's records request was filed, not knowing that Ray had already photographed the lock and documented the timeline of its addition to the vessel, became part of the audit's evidentiary record through Ezra's maritime lawyer. Anchor had flagged the compartment before any of it had been filed. Before anyone had known what was being planned or how far along the planning had gone. Ray never explained to anyone exactly why his dog had known. Some things you just accepted. The compliance audit took 4 months. The freight terminal application was withdrawn during the 3rd month. The cost of the legal exposure, combined with the federal attention, had made the Solomons Island site no longer worth what Merritt's company would have had to pay to continue. The holding company sold the marina. The new buyer was a Maryland-based maritime trust that had been specifically structured by a waterfront preservation nonprofit to maintain commercial fishing operations. Ezra signed his new berth agreement on a Thursday morning. He brought Ray a bushel of blue crabs from his own catch. He left them on the dock with a note that said only, "Thank you." Ray read the note on the dock in the morning light with Anchor sitting beside him. He did not know, at that point, whether to stay in Solomon's Island or to do what he had always done, move when a situation had resolved, find the next place that needed something he could offer. He sat on the dock for a long time with Anchor pressed against his leg. He watched Ezra take the Patuxent girl out past the breakwater and into the bay. The old man stood at the wheel with the specific upright posture of someone who has never once considered that the water belonged to anyone but the people who work it. Ray looked at the water for a long time. He said to Anchor, "All right." He did not say what he meant. The dog already knew. He renewed his security contract for another year. Ray and Anchor remind us of something that is easy to miss. Not every person protecting something looks like what we expect protection to look like. Ray walked those docks for 11 months before the moment came. He did not know it was coming. He only knew his job, and he did it the same way every night. When the moment required more than the job, he gave more, because he had the skills, and because a dog pressed his nose to a hull and held position, and because that was enough. Ezra had been on that water for 60 years. He knew his rights. He knew his history. What he needed was one person who was paying attention at 2 in the morning when everyone else was asleep. That is all it ever takes. If Ray and Anchor's story stayed with you today, drop an amen in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that quiet people doing quiet work are sometimes the ones who change everything. Subscribe, because we have more stories like this one every week. God bless you. And God bless the ones who keep watch.